Program, B.S. English. Course, Literary Criticism. Topic, Aristotle's Theory of Imitation. Prepared by Dr. Shahryar Khan. Question. Critically evaluate Aristotle's theory of imitation. Introduction. When the Greeks of the classical period wanted to characterize the basic nature of painting and sculpture, poetry and music, dance and theater, i.e. things we today call works of art, most of them agreed that such things were mimata, in singular form mimema, the result of an activity they named mimesis. Traditionally, the English word imitation is used, although inadequately, to translate the Greek word mimesis. The philosophical discussion of the behavior denoted by mimesis is commonly called the theory of imitation. In literature, the word mimesis has two diverse applications. It is used to define the nature of literature and other arts and to indicate the relation of one literary work, which serves as a model. Plato and Aristotle take mimesis to define the nature of art, yet they ascribe different meanings and value to it. Point 1. According to Plato, mimetic poetry not only misrepresents gods and heroes and leads young people to immoral behaviors but also appeals to and strengthens the lower, desiring part of the soul. According to Plato, poetry encourages emotions but reason asks us to control these emotions. Reason teaches us to be moral as morality helps to keep society intact. Poetry encourages immoral behavior and, thus, it is harmful for society. As Homer and other poets encourage these base emotions so they cannot be taken as the true teachers of the youth. Mimesis, particularly, becomes a central term when Aristotle discusses the nature and function of art. In the Poetics, he defines tragedy as: a tragedy is the imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude, complete in itself, in language with pleasurable accessories, each kind brought in separately in part of the work, in dramatic not in narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish the catharsis of such emotions. Aristotle says that all human actions involve imitation, and people learn by copying others. In particular, mimesis, imitation, is the main quality that makes someone an artist. He argues that people think anyone who writes in verse is a poet, but they miss the real point that a poet's true quality is the ability to create imitation. A poet is different from other people because he has the special ability to create imitation. A poet can imitate in three different styles in poetry. He may use pure narrative, where he speaks in his own voice without imitation, like in dithyrambs. Or he may use mimetic narrative, where he speaks as his characters, like in comedy and tragedy. A poet may also use mixed narrative, where he sometimes speaks in his own voice and sometimes as his characters, like in epic poetry. Mimetic poetry can also be different depending on what is being imitated. In this way, tragedy is different from comedy because it presents characters as better rather than worse. Point 2. Aristotle is interested in the form of imitation and explains that plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song are the main parts of a typical tragedy. The plot must show a complete action with a clear beginning, middle, and end. All parts of the action must be equally important to the whole. Each part of a tragedy is itself a form of imitation. In tragedy, character imitates the actions of a noble man who must have some social position and personal reputation, but he must also be shown with weaknesses because these weaknesses make his fall believable. Aristotle believes that all types of art are forms of imitation, but they may differ in the manner, means, and object of imitation. Music imitates through sound and rhythm, painting through color, and poetry through action and words. Aristotle's idea of mimesis does not mean the imitation of ideas and appearances like the theory of Plato. He argues that every area of knowledge is imitation because human beings learn through imitation. However, he carefully makes a difference between different kinds of knowledge. For example, he says that art and philosophy deal with different kinds of truth. Philosophy deals with concrete and absolute truth, while art deals with aesthetic and universal truth. He explains the difference between mimetic poetry and history by saying that one writes about what has actually happened, while the other deals with what might happen. Art, unlike science, does not take out only the universal form but imitates the form of individual things and joins separate parts to show both the universal and the particular. Therefore, the function of poetry is not to describe what has happened but to show what may have happened according to the principles of probability and necessity. Since poetry deals with universal truth and history deals only with particular facts, poetry is more philosophical and deserves more serious attention. In addition, the aesthetic representation of reality is not technical, factual, philosophical, or historical. Point 3. Aristotle compares the aesthetic process, mimesis, with the process that happens in nature. While nature works through internal principles, art works through organized principles such as plot, action, characters, and diction, and there is unity among them. In this way, art imitates nature, and the weaknesses of nature are completed during the process of imitation, because art follows the same method that nature would use. Therefore, if a house were a natural product, it would pass through the same stages that it goes through when it is made by art, and both would follow the same process that nature actually takes. Poets, like nature, are able to create both matter and form. The source of nature is nature itself, while the source of art is the artist, and the main quality of the artist is the ability to create through imitation, just as nature does. The artist builds the plot as the main organizing principle, character creates relationships and carries the action forward, and style provides pleasure. In the same way, in tragedy the tragic hero is symbolically sacrificed, after which peace appears. Then the poet takes tragedy as a mimetic representation of myth from the natural course of events that happen in nature and reorganizes it. In this way, mimesis means imitation and also shows the manner in which creation happens, just like it happens in nature. Point 4. Mimesis, as explained by Aristotle, is an active aesthetic process. He argues that imitation is natural to human beings, and people are born with this ability. They slowly develop it and finally create the art of poetry. According to Aristotle, the poet does not simply copy reality but brings reality into existence through mimesis. The poet recreates and reorganizes known facts and presents them in a new and interesting way. Therefore, even though audiences already know the story of Oedipus by Sophocles, they still go to watch the play. The reality shown through mimesis is higher and more universal, not only because people enjoy learning through imitation but also because this form of reality is better. For example, Homer shows Achilles not only as a bad character but also highlights his good qualities. In this way, mimesis means both copying and changing. The poet creates something that did not exist before and for which no model is available. Even when the poet uses historical material, he must shape it according to his art and raise it to a higher level than ordinary reality. Art may be fictional, but its mimetic and aesthetic nature goes beyond this fiction and makes things appear more beautiful and better than what nature and human beings normally possess. Therefore, it is always the writer's duty to make the world better. Conclusion. Aristotle develops a clear theory of art based on the idea of imitation. He begins by saying that all human actions are forms of imitation. Then he focuses on poetry and also discusses other areas of study such as history and philosophy. Finally, he talks about the poet and the idea of imitation as it is used by playwrights. All his arguments about mimesis, both in general and in specific ways, have an aesthetic quality, because he does not consider imitation as a social, moral, or political phenomenon, but as an activity of the artist.